The mast was the only part still above water. It jutted out of the sea like a grave marker, weathered, skeletal, and alone. Below, in the warm, shallow waters of the Florida Straits, the SS Valbanera lay silent, fully intact, gently resting on the ocean floor. When Navy divers first reached the wreck in September of 1919, they expected to find bodies. Hundreds of them. Instead, they found something far more disturbing. The ship was empty. Cabins still held luggage, clothing, children's toys. Tables were still set for meals. Lifeboats were still secured, but not a single passenger or crew member remained. Nearly 500 souls had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no survivors, no cries for help. A shipwreck without the dead. A tragedy without answers. And over a century later, the sea is still keeping its secret. The SS Valbanera was a steel-hulled passenger steamer, 400 feet long and weighing nearly 6,000 tons. Built in Glasgow in 1906 and operated by the Compañía Transatlántica Española, she was designed to carry migrants between Spain and the Caribbean colonies. By 1919, the ship had made dozens of successful crossings between Europe, the Canary Islands, and Cuba. Her final voyage began on August 10, 1919, departing from the port of Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. The ship was packed. Over 1,100 passengers had boarded, mostly Spanish and Cuban migrants, many of them poor laborers or families fleeing post-war instability. The world was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, and the promise of work in Havana or the Americas was a beacon of hope. On board, life was crowded but steady. The first few days passed in the usual way. Card games in the corridors, infants crying in the humid steerage decks, crewmen barking orders through the narrow halls. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the Valbanera docked briefly in Santiago de Cuba, then arrived in Havana on September 5th. There, more than 700 passengers disembarked, but hundreds remained on board. These were the ones bound for ports farther north, Key West, Tampa, perhaps even New Orleans. The details of their final destination remain murky, but what is known is that the ship never made it past the Keys. The storm was already coming. A tropical depression had formed off the southern coast of Puerto Rico days earlier. By the time the Valbanera left Havana, the system had strengthened into a full hurricane. Weather forecasting in 1919 was still rudimentary. Radio bulletins were patchy, and ships often relied on word-of-mouth warnings passed from port to port. Still, the crew knew a storm was nearby. And yet, they pressed north into the Straits of Florida. That night, the seas grew rough. Waves crashed across the bow. Lightning fractured the sky in bursts of blue and white. Barometers dropped. Somewhere between Havana and Key West, the Valbanera sent a final wireless transmission. The message was brief and cryptic. The captain reported that conditions were too dangerous to continue and that he intended to anchor offshore and ride out the storm. Then nothing. Radio silence. By the time the hurricane made landfall on the Florida Keys, it was a full-blown Category 3, with sustained winds over 110 miles per hour. It battered Key West for hours, tearing up docks and flattening homes. Residents reported hearing what they thought was a ship's whistle in the distance, a long, low blast swallowed by wind. But no one could confirm its source. After the storm passed, there was still no sign of the Valbanera. In Havana, families waiting for news began to panic. The shipping company issued vague reassurances. Maybe the ship had found shelter in the Bahamas. Maybe it had diverted to another port. But the truth came to light a few days later, when a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane spotted something just beneath the surface of the water near Rebecca Shoal, a notorious reef system west of Key West. From the air, it looked like a dark shadow, long, rectangular, and unnatural. The Navy dispatched a dive team the following morning. As the divers descended, they were met with eerie stillness. The water was murky but calm. At around 40 feet down, the shape of the ship came into view. It was resting on the seafloor with only minor visible damage. No gaping holes, no torn hull, no evidence of an explosion. The wreck was almost peaceful, as though it had been carefully placed there by unseen hands. Inside the ship, it was like stepping into a time capsule. Beds were still made. Shoes sat neatly on cabin floors. Personal belongings remained undisturbed. Jewelry, prayer books, journals, letters scrawled in Spanish and Catalan. In the dining room, dinnerware had shifted but not shattered. In the engine room, everything was still in working order. The ship had not broken apart, nor had it been ravaged by fire or combat. But it was silent, lifeless. The lifeboats were still secured to their davits. Not one had been launched. Emergency supplies were untouched. There were no signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no torn clothing, no spilled blood, and no people. Every human being who had remained aboard after Havana was gone. Navy divers returned multiple times. The wreck was mapped, inspected, and quietly declared a total loss. No effort was made to raise her. The Spanish government issued a brief statement of mourning. Families were notified. A mass casualty list was posted in Havana, listing 488 names. There was no official investigation, no inquiry, no closure, just a silent ship and a vanished population. In the months that followed, strange items began to appear across the Caribbean. A child's boot washed ashore in the Bahamas. A torn sailor's cap was found tangled in driftwood on the Cuban coast. Life preservers bearing the name Valbanera were recovered as far north as Miami. But no human remains were ever discovered. Not a single body, not one confirmed grave. Ocean currents in the Florida Straits are strong, but they don't erase the dead. Some believe the ship took on water too quickly for anyone to escape. Others suggest that seawater breached lower decks and suffocated the sleeping passengers in minutes. But even then, where were the bodies? There are theories, of course. One holds that the Valbanera ran aground on Rebecca Shoal and was battered by the storm for hours. With her engines stalled and bilge pumps failing, the captain may have ordered an emergency evacuation. But if so, why were all the lifeboats still in place? Another theory suggests that the crew abandoned ship and left the passengers behind, hoping to return after the storm. But there's no record of any survivors ever coming forward. No unexplained appearances in distant ports. No claims of lifeboat sightings, just silence. And then there are the stories. Fishermen in the Florida Keys tell of a glowing shape beneath the water on moonless nights. Divers have returned from the wreck shaken, some refusing to speak about what they saw inside. There are tales of cold spots in the cabins, of whispers in Spanish echoing through the submerged hallways. They say the Valbanera is not just a wreck. It's a graveyard, a haunted one. Over time, the tragedy was forgotten. No books were written, no movies made. The story slipped through the cracks of history, overshadowed by more famous shipwrecks, more photogenic disasters. But the loss was staggering. 488 people gone without a trace, mothers and fathers, young children, elderly couples clutching rosaries, men chasing dreams of a new life. All vanished in a matter of hours, and no one in power seemed to want to talk about it. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps it was bureaucracy. Or perhaps the truth was too disturbing to confront. Today, the Valbanera remains where she fell. Time and tide have not erased her. The wreck is still visited by divers, though few linger long. Coral has grown over the deck rails. Fish dart through open portholes. But the bones of the ship endure, and the cabins are still intact. Inside, you can find mirrors clouded with silt, coat hooks still bearing hats, spoons resting beside empty plates, everything in place except the people. The sea took them, or something else did. No one can say. What is certain is this: of all the maritime disasters in history, few are as strange or as silent as the fate of the SS Valbanera. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.